So my name is Alicia Pizzino, and I am President-elect of Rutland Young Professionals. I'm here with Justine Ruhlin, Assistant Principal of Rutland Intermediate School, and Ted Plemenos, Director of Finance of Rutland City Public Schools. And we are going to share some important information about the school budget. And I just want to thank you both for joining us tonight.
It's nice to be with you.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. So Rutland City Public Schools provides kindergarten through grade 12 education for about 1,900 students in our region, which includes about 220 students enrolled at Stafford Technical Center. And the district employs a staff of about 500 individuals, including many young professionals. So I want to start this off by asking, what is the purpose of the school budget?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in if that's okay. Really, there are several important purposes of the budget. The first is it enables educators and staff to think about their programming for the coming year, reflect upon the kinds of resources that will be needed, and of course, ultimately to translate those resource needs into dollars. That's particularly important when educators are thinking about innovations in education and what new tools they may need to bring forward to continuously improve the programming that we offer. From a financial control standpoint, obviously a budget allows us to monitor and then control the approval of expenditures. And that's very important in fulfilling our fiduciary role of responsibility to the taxpayers who fund the majority of our educational expenditures. And then it also, from a mechanical standpoint, allows the district to go ahead and fulfill a variety of reporting needs. When you ask people in governments for money, that comes with the obligation to provide reports and information telling them what you've done with it. And so the budget is a tool that allows us to do that as well. But again, I look at it as a means to an end. The most important part of budgeting, just as it would be for any person or family, is to think about what I'm going to be doing, when, what it's going to cost, and how do I ensure that the right resources are in place when we need them.
Great. So how much is the annual school district budget, and how does this compare to last year?
The budget for the coming fiscal year, which will be fiscal 22, is going to be $58 million as proposed. And I might just mention, for the benefit of our audience, schools, not surprisingly, are on not a calendar fiscal year, but on a fiscal year that matches the school year. So it runs from July 1st to June 30 of a given year. So our current budget running through June 30 of 2021 was approved last year, and now we're proposing $58 million of expenditure starting July 1 of this year and running into the middle of 22. That actually is a reduction of almost $1 million from the current year's budget. We have set out a goal to try and more than offset increases in salaries and benefits for our teachers and our staff with efficiencies and cost savings in other areas. That's for a number of reasons, including, of course, the challenging economic times that we have. What's interesting about the budget is, and this shouldn't be a surprise, I suppose, is that about 80% of all expenditures for the district are what you'd call people related. Their salaries and their benefits programs, medical insurance, life insurance, dental, that sort of thing. So that's 80% of the budget, believe it or not, and the other 20% pays for everything else that we do. What we set about doing was to challenge ourselves to find efficiencies and cost savings measures that would not compromise our educational programs, but could help us basically absorb inflation, those higher salary and benefits costs, and perhaps deliver a reduction. And working closely with people, basically since September of last year, we think we've come up with responsible ways to do that.
Great. What are your school's projected student enrollment?
That is a very interesting question. One of the first things I did in this position, and I joined the district in July of last year, was to take a look at some of the demographic trends. And if you go back to the year 2000, you could see that the district had an enrollment of about 2,900 students. That has declined gradually but steadily over the years to the point where we're now at a bit under 2,000 students in the range of 1,900. So we've seen declines pretty much along with the state population, and also paralleling declines in other district enrollments of anywhere from 1 to 3% per year. I haven't seen any change or attenuation of that in the last few years.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely evident by Vermont's growing population and not as many families choosing to live here and kind of raise children. So it's not surprising that you're kind of seeing the same downward trend for enrollment.
Right. Although one of the things we have started to see, and it will be very interesting, is, COVID, of course, and the pandemic have brought a lot of hardships and challenges, but there are also some potentially interesting developments, because as people have moved out of New York, and I, as a newcomer, I see a lot of New York license plates here myself. There are people who have been moving in and buying properties. In fact, if you talk to the city tax assessor, he'll tell you that market values have been moving up as people coming from out of state are buying. So you would think that eventually that might translate into increased student enrollments. And ultimately, if you're a young professional, I have two boys who are now off of my payroll, thankfully, and they're out working as young professionals themselves. And like many, they are working remotely. I have a son who started in New York City and he got out last March. He's been working remotely from Austin, Texas ever since. I've got another son who's also working remotely all of the time. So I think as people find that working remotely works better, both for companies and people, maybe Vermont will benefit. I mean, given the quality of life that is offered here and all the 5G that we have in Rutland now, perhaps we'll see an influx at some point of young professionals realizing you can get quite a quality of life at a lower cost of living here. So I'm cautiously optimistic looking ahead.
Absolutely.
And I can really speak to that as a newcomer and a young professional in Rutland now, as someone who's new to the area. That's definitely a draw for myself and for my partner about Rutland City. It has the amenities of a city, but the proximity to the outdoors, the Green Mountains, and a wonderful school district. So I can speak to and provide truth to what Ted is talking about, how much young people could gain from living here and working here.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Justine. So my next question is, who is involved with preparing the school budget?
What a great question. And let me just start off by asking, Justine, let me put you on the spot and ask, were you involved at all in the preparation of the last budget? And it's okay to say no, but I'm wondering.
Yes, there were preliminary conversations and discussions that I was a part of. And I've also that Ted has put together on how this formula is put together and how the budget comes together as well.
Thank you. As Justine's comments illustrate, it's a very wide swath of people who are involved. And basically you can think of the fact that we go around to every school and every school's administration and every program's director. And I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that, Justine is probably one of 30 to 40 people out of the 500 that are involved directly involved in the district's budgeting process, because we're going around and we're asking the basic questions of, as I laid out earlier, what are you going to need in the coming year for resources? What are those likely to cost? Are there any new tools that you think you're going to need? Are there areas that we can save? And of course, the people who can make those decisions best are the people like Justine and her colleagues. So we actually started in late August and early September going around and meeting and soliciting that input and guidance. I will say that as we started conducting those meetings, we had at the administration level done some preliminary analysis and realized again, this is going to be a year of fiscal challenges, and need for consideration to our, taxpayers who take care of everything. So we did give the direction to everybody that in the coming fiscal year, we would like to target for our expenses to be flat to down. And so what we said is now we'd like you to think about your programs. Perhaps there are areas that you don't need to spend money in anymore because they're lower priority. Perhaps there are new areas where it's essential that you do spend money. You kind of start trading one for the other. But let's target for flat to down and then come back to us and tell us if that's manageable, if not. Because one of the draws of a community like Rutland City, of course, is that it has a long-standing reputation, well earned, for high quality of education. And while we want to be fiscally responsible, of course, you got to manage for the long term, which is you're here to serve the students and give them the opportunities that an excellent education provides. Much as you and I were discussing earlier, Alicia, it can be the key to unlocking so many doors. And so we've gone through that process. We went through several iterations. We were able to find quite a number of areas of efficiencies. And so again, we didn't take a top-down, you must do it in this way approach. We took a top-down approach to say, these are the parameters we're looking for, the general guidelines, and then bottom up, can you help us work it in this way? And so we had a lot of people within the district. I actually spoke to a few teachers whom I've come to know just to ask their input. And then once that was pulled together by about the November timeframe, then another 4 key people were involved. And that goes beyond our superintendent, assistant superintendent. But we have a finance committee. So 4 members of the school board, of the elected school board, are dedicated just to finance issues. So in November and December, our team started reviewing with them so that as the elected representatives, of the city to steward the school programs and issues, we got into the details about what we were doing to find efficiencies and cost savings, what we were doing to invest in continuing the excellence of education, and went through some iterations for them. And once they were satisfied, then in December and January, we went forward to the full board of school commissioners, which are almost a dozen people, I think about 11, again, all elected officials to present. And they said, okay, after we had given them certain analysis and backup information. So by the time you include about a dozen people on the board, those additional members and all the folks I've mentioned, it's probably well over 50 that were directly involved. So it's supposed to be a very inclusive process, because the more perspective you have, the better. And then we understand that there are, differences of opinions and perspectives in terms of what the prioritization will be. But it's better to have those facts on the table, understand where you agree and disagree, and on occasions in which if we can't close the gap, we have the key officials make the call. And so a long process, but an important one. And I can't believe that in a few months, we're going to have to start it all over again.
Well, it's definitely one of those recurring processes that starts as soon as it ends.
That's it. You hit it, Alicia.
So what priorities were in mind as the proposed budget was being developed?
Alicia, do you want to speak to some of the priorities that you had in mind when you and your colleagues, Justine, that you and your colleagues were thinking about as you were coming up with ideas for your budget? Because I'm sure you had, being on the front lines and seeing what the students need, you probably had quite a few competing priorities.
Yeah, so the first and foremost being the implications of returning to school with COVID, and ensuring that we have a safe and successful school year. And that's attributed to all of the efforts of our educators, our paraprofessionals, our counselors, our custodians, our food service workers, our bus drivers, our nurses, our school leaders, and our community working together. And so it was a lot of planning and a lot of continued legwork by all of those stakeholders. And so when we had those conversations, we're going to see impact from COVID for a while now. So trying to predict what we're going to need for the future and how long this is going to impact us certainly brought about some challenging conversations. But I can speak to just the incredible contributions of our educators that are working here within the district, and all of the incredible work that they have done this year and will continue to do in years to come.
As part of those discussions that Justine was describing, those were ongoing really since at least the spring of 2020. And I know that when I joined the district in the summer of 2020, we were having weekly, if not more than weekly, planning sessions to go through and discuss at a cabinet level many of the issues that Justine described. And when you raise a topic, of course, that has this degree of complexity and these many interactions as she was describing, you don't get to an answer necessarily right away. And I was really impressed with the focus and the dedication that so many people brought to all those considerations. But as Justine said, I think it's really the fact that the school's been open as much as it has throughout this year, with a few exceptions, really is testimony to the effectiveness and the thoroughness of the planning that was done. In addition to the priorities, though, that we've talked about, I think, if I were to think about a non-COVID year and a sort of traditional priority, it would be, of course, the commitment of the district to meet each student where he or she is. And, in a community that has the diversity that this community has, and especially in a community that has the socioeconomic challenges that we find in different parts of the community. I mean, nobody will be surprised when we say that, when kids come to kindergarten and first grade, they come at very different stages of readiness, with very different stages of preparation and challenges. And so one of the things that the school does, and we've put a serious priority on this over the past several years before I arrived, was to look at what early intervention might be necessary to fill readiness gaps and to make sure that as students enter the educational program, again, whether it be kindergarten or first grade, the early grades, that they get a good start. Because we all know in so many things in life, a good start is essential. And one of the things that, I'm still relatively new to education, public education, one of the things that I really didn't appreciate, although as many young professionals, and now I'm an old professional, but we benefited from a really good education, many of us. And but the scope of the educational services is changing so much, not only because the world is so much more competitive, but because so many students, when they come, they need assistance with technology. When this district went to switch to remote, not everybody has internet access. Not everybody has a laptop computer. And so one of the priorities was to either invest in some, Chromebook laptops where students needed them, in terms of IT infrastructure to support all of the remote learning. Some of the very creative people here in the district even went to partner with Vermont Telephone to get their assistance in providing Wi-Fi and internet access, and other equipment where people couldn't afford it. So a great deal of creativity and planning went into making sure that all the key fundamentals, building blocks, if you will, of the budget would be there. And I guess one other priority, maybe it's not last and it's certainly not least, but is to ensure that by managing these resources carefully, let's face it, you have to pay for talent, you have to pay for performance, you have to pay for results. And, whether I'm a consultant or, a controller or a teacher, it's the same principle. And so the district's been very successful at recruiting and training and retaining a very capable and motivated staff. And so one of the budget priorities is to make sure that the district can continue to compensate people appropriately. It's not to say that you're going to be the highest payer in your industry, but you're certainly not going to be the lowest, because you want to, again, maintain the longevity of the people who are the ones who are teaching the children and the students. So definitely we made sure to be careful of our resources, not only in deference to the taxpayer, but to make sure that the compensation goes to where it's truly needed and makes the most difference.
Great. Where do the resources for the school budgets and educational programming come from?
That's a very interesting question. And the easy answer is to say most of it comes from the state of Vermont. About 60% of it comes from the state of Vermont. And I'm going to get a little bit more specific in a minute. So of that $58 million that we've talked about in the coming year, about 34 million is going to come directly from the state's general education fund. And some of you may have been following in the press some of the various developments and news articles about what's happening to that general education fund. There was a period of time last year where people were very concerned that it was going to run a deficit. Very fortuitously now, sales tax and other revenues have been increasing. So now that general ed fund looks like it's in better shape than we had expected even in 6 months ago. So that's a really good news thing. Our local taxpayers here in the Rutland City last year they provided about $14 million out of that 58 or 59. And there's an interesting breakdown there because of that 14 million, 5 million is directly paid by homestead property owners, and the other 9 million is paid by non-commercial and non-homestead property owners. So if you take that 14 million and you divide by 58 or so, you realize that about 25 cents on the dollar comes locally, and then about 75 cents on the dollar gets sent in. The other 10 million I haven't mentioned comes from federal grants, Title I, Title II, that sort of thing. So, you know, Rutland City actually is a net beneficiary when it comes to funding. That's a good news thing because, again, for those who, you know, have an economics or a finance background, you might be familiar with the term multiplier effect. When you have, for every 75 cents or a dollar that is sent into the community to pay Justine, myself, teachers, other people, we're going to turn around and spend those dollars in the community on various things, and then the grocer will respend it and the utility will respend it. And what they say is, on average, if for every dollar that's brought in, it generates a multiplier of $2.50 of income as it rolls through and cascades through the economy. So, you know, that's kind of a good situation for our city. We do get special grants on occasion, and particularly with COVID, you know, right now, I guess we've got that $1.9 trillion package that's making its way through Congress, but earlier legislation last year created a number of grants that our district was able to take advantage of. One was for special funding for secondary schools and primary schools. We were able to apply for and were granted $1 million there. There was some COVID relief funding special provisions. We were able to get several $100,000 of that. Again, not necessarily continuing, but it was available. And so we worked very hard to get whatever resources we qualified for. And because every dollar is appreciated, when we heard that Efficiency Vermont was offering some grants for HVAC, heating, air conditioning, and ventilation and filters, we were able to get $20,000 from them for upgrades to the filters in our buildings to go to better filters that are more effective at screening COVID out. Naturally, those filters are more expensive. They have to be changed out more often, which is why Efficiency Vermont was willing to help many districts across the state with that. So hope that gives you a little bit of a profile. So there are multiple sources, many grants, many federal opportunities, but the majority of it comes from the state.
Great. How are you investing in our schools?
There are several things that I would mention, but Justine, let me ask you from the standpoint of the intermediate school, is there anything that you would like to say first regarding investments that we're making in schools and their programming?
Sure. So this year, especially with remote learning, we're looking at platforms like Zern and Lexia that are focusing on math and literacy that we can move between in-person and virtual learning seamlessly. Specifically at the intermediate school and I believe primary schools, looking at the positive behavior and intervention support systems, the PBIS programs. And actually for our school next week, we have a whole school-wide celebration. Our students use a token system, and every class fills up a jar, and then once they fill the jar, they dump it into a big bin in the middle of the school, and we just filled a huge bin So we're gonna have a celebration next week. And we're also utilizing and investing in programs that follow restorative approaches and restorative justice work, and working with our students to resolve conflict through conversation, circles, community block, community meetings as well. So, and we're also additionally working with our students and our teachers to be more trauma informed, and to make sure that our teaching and our conversations have that lens of the impact of COVID, but also that we are working with our families and partnering with them in their meeting the needs of their children and our students.
That's much appreciated. I think that I could add a couple of other things. Justine already talked about the technology, but we have to give kudos for the selective investment and planning approach that people before us had taken in the IT area, because again, one reason why the district was able basically last March, to flip within 48 to 72 hours from in-person to remote was fortunately because they had made judicious investments over time in infrastructure and hardware and the like. But the applications that Justine is describing to manage, process and interaction, that's key. And, we have tried to make room in the IT budget, knowing that new applications like that are going to come along to facilitate and make more effective the changes in formatting to remote and hybrid and that sort of thing. So planning ahead is key, and then working with the folks to get their input directly in terms of what's going to make the most difference. The other two areas that I would mention just briefly that we're investing in, one is energy conservation. And it's very impressive. The district has been partnering with Johnson Controls for about 10 years in order to make serious strides to reduce the amount of energy that it consumes, which is of course, good from an environmental standpoint in general, and also helps the district reduce costs. Some of you may have driven by the high school or Stafford Technical, I'm sure have seen some of the solar panels that are put up there. Those are part of an overall series of initiatives that, believe it or not, have helped the district to reduce by 50% its energy consumption from 2010 to this year. There are not too many organizations that can say they've cut their consumption in half. So I could describe a whole lot of other initiatives that have gone on, but energy conservation definitely has been a focus with a high return in many respects. And another area in which we've invested is last year, the district worked with an engineering firm to conduct a facilities condition assessment. So it's general recommended and best practice every 5 to 10 years to do a very close survey and examination of the condition of your buildings, the equipment. Are you maintaining your preventive maintenance programs? The whole point is to ensure operations integrity so that students and teachers can come to school safely every day and have the kind of environment that they need. So they concluded this study, and we're just now in the process of trying to prioritize those needs and what they might look like over the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. So we're investing a lot of time right now into looking at what will the footprint look like for our schools, and where is the best place and where are the first places to put some of those facilities dollars. So that's going to be a very interesting area for the district to invest in.
Great. And Justine, I really appreciated your response about, showing support for our students in other ways, especially, as Ted noted, students in Rutland City Public Schools come from, various socioeconomic, levels, and, each student has different challenges. So I think really meeting students where they're at and, investing in ways to support them is definitely, you all deserve kudos for that. And I think it's something that our community appreciates.
Thank you.
How does the school budget impact things like sports and the arts and other co-curricular activities?
Justine, do you want to talk about that in terms of what you see at the intermediate school?
I think just with being a newcomer and joining during COVID, the extracurriculars and arts, it's been limited this year due to those safety protocols and procedures. So I don't think that I'm the most informed at this time and still have more to learn.
Okay, well, that's a great answer. Thank you. But I will add that when I was doing some research before applying for this job here in this district, one of the things that attracted me to this school district is because of the richness and breadth of its programs in athletics, in various areas of the arts, as important as they are, whether it's the theater or music or other visual arts. It's very, very impressive. I mean, we have students here who have participated in many competitions and done very well. To me, it's not about the awards that they win, as it is an indication of they have an opportunity to explore areas to determine, do I like this? Am I good at this, or am I not? Many districts that I've seen, as my 3 kids went through school, they found it easy to cut the arts and things like that in a budget crunch. Maybe some athletic teams that were not considered as popular as others. But this district has been very responsible and careful to try and make sure that its students benefit from the breadth of those opportunities, which in my opinion is an essential part of what we call education. It's not just in the classroom, of course, as Justine was describing. So the other way I'd answer your question is to say in putting together the budget for fiscal year 22 coming up, we have optimistically assumed that things will return to somewhat quasi-normal starting in the fall, and that we have budgeted for a full suite of normal programming athletically and arts-wise. So we look forward to being able to enjoy that.
Mm-hmm.
Great. How do you allocate for the special education program?
I wish we had Pam Reed, our Director of Equity and Inclusion and Diversity and Special Education. But what I would tell you is that we follow some very clear guidelines from the state that says if students with certain needs are identified, then these kinds of services will be provided. That oftentimes gets summed up in what's called an individual education plan, or an IEP. Out of our roughly 2,000 students, about 400 students this year are involved in IEPs. We're projecting that's going to increase to 425 next year. So it's a pretty significant percentage of the total student enrollment who is benefiting, where needs have been identified and it's been determined that some special provisions and focused educational opportunities will benefit them. The good news from just a fiscal standpoint is the state recognizes that typically those services will cost a bit more. On average for the district, it might cost about $16,000 or $17,000 per pupil per year to educate. Sometimes some of these plans can be many tens of thousands of dollars depending upon the student need, and that'll change year to year depending upon many factors. But the state will compensate a very substantial percentage of those additional funding needs. So the answer to your question is, how do we budget? Well, first we determine what the needs are. We use criteria. We have a wonderful group of professional educators who are very familiar with special education needs. We make sure that we're following state protocol. Then we budget accordingly, and then make sure that we get the reimbursements from the state of Vermont or the federal government. What we have found with this, again, not surprisingly, is that if you do the right thing at the right time, and particularly if you can do it early, you end up not only benefiting the student very significantly in their development and potential, but strictly from an economic standpoint, you can end up reducing your costs long term, because something that is not taken care of early on oftentimes can become more complex, more costly, and more devastating from a personal standpoint. So that I'm very proud of what this district is doing, and I'm still just learning.
Great. What budget reductions will be taking place, if any?
In terms of budget reductions, there are actually several areas. Believe it or not, I just finished speaking about special education. The special education program costs are actually expected to decline next year versus this year. And that may seem a little counterintuitive because I just told you that the number of individual education plans will be increasing, but the mix and the intensity of services that will be needed and the particular students and their needs will change in such a way that our total costs will go down. Also, our director in this area has been implementing a plan to bring certain services that had been provided by third parties outside of the district in-house, if you will. And she started that initiative mainly because by bringing it in-house, it allows the district to provide more continuity for the students, get to know them better, track and monitor things better. But as it turns out, that'll also save us some money. So that's going to be a help. We did target, unfortunately, and these are always hard decisions, to reduce our staffing next year versus the fiscal 21 budget. In this year's current budget, we had about 518 full-time job equivalents budgeted. We have 501 proposed in the budget that we're asking to be approved next week. Most of those are aid positions, support positions, typically part-time positions. Some of them are full-time teacher positions. Those decisions are made obviously with great difficulty because these are dedicated and productive people who've contributed greatly to the school system. But a lot of people at the administration level, including the superintendent and assistant superintendent, were involved in that decision process. And sometimes with a declining enrollment, periodically, you do need to make certain adjustments to kind of stay in alignment and calibrated. And we're going to do the best we can to help those affected transition to new opportunities.
Great. Will the recent UVM study of Vermont's formula for allocation of education funds impact Rutland City Public Schools this year?
Justine, do you want to talk about that, or would you like me to jump in on that?
I think maybe you would be better suited to discuss that.
Okay, yeah, it just depends on,
Sure.
Different people have had different levels of exposure to this. The key words, I think, in your question were at the end, Alicia, if I caught it right, and you said this year, right? You asked, will it impact this year? Okay,
Yes.
So the answer is, I don't know, okay? So then it becomes, what would I think or guess? And let me just start with what I do know, and then we can take it from there. So just for anybody who hasn't heard of this study before, basically back in December of 2019, the University of Vermont and a panel of nationally recognized educators did a study of the way that the state allocates that education funding that I talked about earlier, coming out of the general education fund to more than 100 districts and supervisory unions around the state. Obviously, they need some kind of method for deciding who's going to get how much money. And the system that they've used over the past 20 plus years has been one that tries to measure the number of pupils that a district has on what they call an equivalent basis. What does that mean? Well, if I have one student in my classroom, and that student is considered an average student with no special needs either way, then that's called one student. If I have a student who's coming in who, say, just to use an example, for whom English is not their primary language, so they are what's considered to be an English language learner, well, that might involve a little extra educational support and some resourcing as the student gets to know English better. And so what the state will do is to say, oh, if you have somebody who's an English language learner, we'll actually count that as that might take 10% more education effort. It's just an example. It's not an actual number. So we'll give you credit for 1.1 students instead of just one in that case. So the state developed a weighting system that took into account, I can't say that recognized because there's a lot of different opinions on that, but took into account different factors. If somebody's coming from a low income family, they might require more educational services or support. So they came up with this weighting, but guess what? those weightings haven't changed dramatically over the last 20 years, even though socio-demographic trends have shifted significantly. So this study that I mentioned, and it was an incredibly impressive study, took a look at those weights, came to the conclusion that they were significantly out of date with, again, things that have been going on across this state for many years, and recommended that those weightings and thus the allocation of dollars be changed and updated for some, current socio-demographic metrics. Well, that is a very controversial topic because the question is, are those recommendations correct? What's the impact going to be? Who's going to get more? Who's going to get less? And so that's one reason why perhaps this whole topic hasn't been addressed in a while. But right now, there are two bills in the Vermont legislature, one in the House, one in the Senate. There might even be another one, but I know of two of them that are receiving attention because districts across the state, and it doesn't matter if it's an urban district or a rural district. It doesn't matter if it's a big enrollment district or a small enrollment district. Many districts are feeling the pain of, in their opinion, not getting funding that's adequate to meet current needs. And so the legislators are really finally taking a look at this, and it's, and it's very timely, even though it's a very complex topic, and even though they have a lot on their agenda, right? With COVID, they have plenty of other issues that need to be resolved this year as well, but they're taking up the legislation. So it probably will not actually impact the funding for this current fiscal year coming up, fiscal 2022. But it is possible that if the legislature does move in the current session this year on some of these proposals, that in the next year or two, it could start to have a fairly dramatic impact. So we'll be monitoring that, and in acknowledgement of the legislature's thoughtful process so far, one thing that I have read that I think is important is they're very cognizant of the fact that while some districts will get more funds to help their communities and students, maybe there'll be less available for some others. And if that's the case, then they're going to phase in a transition of at least 3 years, that's in the current bill, so that there can be, they're not going to throw anybody through the windshield. They're going to be an adjustment process if they move on this. So I guess we could talk to you in a year if you're interested, but my guess would be if we have this conversation a year from now, we'll say, hopefully, yes, the legislation was passed and the Agency of Education is now in the implementation phase, and we're moving forward.
Definitely something to keep our eyes on and to kind of stay apprised to what's happening as this moves through the legislature. Do voters usually approve the proposed budget by a wide margin, and has it been close in the past?
That's an excellent question. One thing that I noticed is that, well, the last few years at least, of records that I looked at, and people who've been in the city longer than Justine and I guess, could tell you, but it seems like as far as back as I've got records, that it's been approved, and it's typically been by, a pretty good margin. I guess the city is divided into 4 wards, and some wards are typically more pro-budget than others. One thing that I noticed as I looked at the voting results for last year at this time is that in the article for the approval or the rejection of the school budget, there were more than 4,000 votes cast, and I guess we've got about, 15 or 16,000 people in the city. So more than 4,000 votes cast. That was up 70% from the number of votes that were cast the year before, which was more like 2,500 as opposed to 4,200. And a lot of that increased participation came in the form of increased support for the budget. So most of the wards approved the budget by a 60 to 40% majority or better. And so it's not unanimous, but at least you could say that there's a pretty significant margin in recent years.
Great. So my last question for you both is, how can we ensure that our school budgets support our schools?
Well, I would like to hear Justine's answer to that, because I'm a service provider to her.
Mm-hmm. my hope is that our community and our stakeholders see how much we care about their children and how much we care about the prosperity and the success and the health of our community members and our children. And by getting out and voting and participating in our democratic processes here at the local level, we're just looking for that support from our families and to continue to support our schools across the district. Yeah, I think, Ted, what are your thoughts there? What could you build off there?
I would say that you have expressed it so well, I can't add anything more to that. And I applaud you for that. That's really a great way to describe it. I like the fact that you said, we just would like people to come out and vote and express your opinion, and hopefully it will be supportive. But if it's not, as you said, Justine, it's the democratic process. We just want people to vote. And I want to tell you, as Justine, I think, has shown tonight throughout this discussion, I mean, we are so fortunate to have people like her and her colleagues who are so dedicated to our students in our community. I mean, we are fortunate beyond words. So I just want to thank you, Justine, and everybody for all that you're doing. And Alicia, thank you for asking us these questions.
Absolutely. Quickly, can you remind voters of when they can, use their democratic process to either support the school budget or not, if they so choose?
Sure. Well, the voting, the town meeting day is next Tuesday, March 2nd. I believe that there may have been early voting. I don't know whether that's still open. And in addition to voting on Tuesday, if anybody has further questions about either the budget or the process or anything related to that, the district is going to conduct on Monday evening, the 1st, from 6:30 to 7:30, an information session, which will be open to questions from the public. So if anybody is interested in that, there's a Zoom link that's on the district's website, and everybody is welcomed and encouraged to attend. We do want to hear people's questions, just like as Justine said, we want people to vote, because it's an important process that's for all of our behalfs.
Absolutely. We'll be able to share that Zoom link with our members as well, to make sure that they have it at their hands. So thank you both for kind of sitting down and chatting with us. This has been great. And, it's such an important piece of information to share with voters and residents of Rutland City. So thank you both for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.